to his very famous family. The Daily Beast reports that this is a win.
For decades, their lives were surrounded by whispers, broken trust, scandal, exile, and secrets no royal dared to utter aloud. But when Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson looked into the camera and uttered 6 chilling words, "It's time to tell you everything," the world instantly sensed something unprecedented was coming. Because behind their carefully controlled public smiles lies a buried truth so explosive, it threatens not just their reputations, but the very balance of the monarchy itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. And in that instant, the air around them shifted, not with the practiced calm of a staged royal moment, but with the weight of something they could no longer suppress. This was not a rehearsed confession, nor a controlled palace narrative polished by advisors and whispered through corridors. This was 2 people who had been pushed into the shadows for too long, finally turning toward the storm they once fled from. The decision to speak without palace approval was not just bold, it was defiant, a direct challenge to an institution that thrives on silence, subtlety, and the illusion of unbreakable unity. Andrew sat rigid, his posture controlled, his voice carefully measured as if every syllable carried a lifetime of consequences. Sarah, in contrast, carried an emotional tremor beneath her poise, the kind of vulnerability that only emerges when someone has endured years of being misunderstood, dismissed, or strategically sidelined. Together, they created a tension that felt almost dangerous, because when they promised to tell everything, it was not simply a promise of confession, it was a warning. Within the palace, the implications struck like a silent alarm. The moment the words left their lips, senior courtiers exchanged looks of dread, aware that certain truths were never meant to escape the gilded walls. Advisors scrambled behind closed doors, issuing calls, drafting emergency responses, anticipating narratives they could not control. Some feared exposure, others feared the collapse of long-maintained facades. And deep beneath the surface, there was the haunting possibility that Andrew and Sarah were not driven by desperation, but by a revelation so devastating it could rip through the monarchy's foundations. Their message hinted at a story far more complex than personal redemption. It whispered of hidden loyalties, of betrayals buried under decades of royal protocol, of secrets protected not out of love, but out of fear of what their unveiling might unleash. And as Andrew's eyes hardened with a resolve few had ever seen, and Sarah's voice softened with the weight of everything she had held inside, it became clear that this was not a moment of catharsis. It was a beginning the crown had hoped would never arrive. But to understand why their voices shook, and why the crown fears their confession, more than any scandal before, we must go back to the first fracture in their royal lives. Long before the controversies, long before exile and disgrace, there was a moment, quiet, painful, and carefully buried, that shaped every decision Andrew and Sarah would make. It is the secret that neither advisors nor biographers ever uncovered, because it wasn't about infidelity or money. It was about loyalty, a betrayal not of each other, but of someone far higher, someone whose trust, once broken, forever changed the direction of their lives. And that is why this single moment, hidden behind formal smiles and rehearsed gestures, still clings to them like a shadow they've never been able to outrun. In the early years of their marriage, when the world was convinced they were carefree, united, and untouchable, a private incident unfolded that cracked the fragile foundation beneath their royal roles. It was something so sensitive, so dangerously intimate to the heart of the monarchy, that both of them understood instantly that it must never leave the quiet walls where it happened. They carried it in silence, not out of fear, but out of the sinking realization that revealing it would reshape how the crown viewed them forever. And in many ways, it did, because the Queen, a woman whose instincts rarely failed, sensed something had shifted. She didn't confront them, nor did she express disappointment in words. But the cold distance that emerged in the days that followed was unmistakable. Andrew felt it first, the subtle withdrawal of warmth, replaced by a polite but unmistakable scrutiny. Sarah felt it too, not through words, but through the tightening atmosphere around her. A reminder that within the palace, trust was a currency far more valuable than affection. What made the wound worse was the emotional strain their silence created between them. They weren't angry with each other. They were haunted by the same fear, the same guilt, the same knowledge that they had crossed an invisible line, and because they could tell no one, not even the closest confidantes who orbited their royal world, the secret grew heavier, shaping their relationship, their decisions, and eventually, the very trajectory of their lives. They made a vow then, spoken not with ceremony but with weary eyes and trembling breaths, that the truth would remain between them forever. They believed time would dull its sting, that loyalty would protect them, that the past would remain buried. But secrets do not weaken over time, they deepen. And as events unfolded in the years ahead, Andrew's later downfall was not isolated. It echoed directly back to this silent fracture, the moment that shifted the palace's perception and made him vulnerable to forces neither of them anticipated. It is why their voices tremble now, why their confession carries weight beyond personal redemption, and why the truth they shielded for decades still burns beneath everything they have endured. Yet even this early wound was only the beginning, because what followed would tie the couple to forces inside the palace they never meant to confront. Every royal knows the institution is bigger than any single person, but Andrew and Sarah discovered something darker, a hidden network of power brokers inside the palace who operated in silence, far from public view, a machine built to protect the monarchy at any cost. And once Andrew stumbled into its path, every move he made, every mistake, every rumor, was weaponized with terrifying precision. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with an invitation withdrawn without explanation and a private briefing Andrew was mysteriously excluded from. At first, he dismissed it as oversight, but Sarah, whose instincts had always been sharper than people gave her credit for, felt the shift immediately. Something was moving around them, cold, strategic, and deeply invested in steering their lives in a direction neither of them chose. There was talk soft, voices in hallways ending abruptly when Andrew approached, advisors exchanging glances that carried meaning far beyond their spoken reassurances. The unnamed inner circle, a group no one openly acknowledged but everyone silently obeyed, had turned its attention toward him. Their power did not come from titles or public roles, but from the ability to shape narratives before they even reached the outside world. Andrew unknowingly angered one of its most influential members during a private disagreement over protocol, a conflict he assumed would fade into insignificance. Instead, it marked the beginning of a campaign designed to undermine him with subtle precision. Sarah sensed the tension first. Her warnings came as gentle nudges, questions about why a particular rumor had spread so quickly, or why a story that should have remained private suddenly appeared in places it should never have reached. Andrew tried to reassure her, insisting that the palace was simply being cautious. But, as more leaks surfaced, details only a handful of insiders could possibly know. It became clear that caution wasn't the motive. Control was. The inner circle began shaping a narrative that cast Andrew as reckless, untrustworthy, and increasingly isolated. And the more he tried to correct the distortions, the deeper the trap became, because every attempt to defend himself was effortlessly twisted into something more damaging. What made it worse was the increasing pressure to distance himself from Sarah. Advisors framed the suggestion as concern for appearances, but Andrew recognized the manipulation too late. Their bond, one of the few constants in his life, was being weaponized to weaken him emotionally. The network wanted him alone, vulnerable, and easier to steer. And once he realized it, the chill of betrayal settled in his chest, not because of what they believed about him, but because of how far they were willing to go to maintain their power. All the while, a more devastating, the storm was forming at the edges of his life, whispers that would eventually erupt into the scandal that destroyed his public standing. Those who knew the truth later admitted privately that the early signs were already there, buried beneath the palace's polished facade. It was not coincidence. It was preparation. And Andrew, unaware of the full scale of what was unfolding, was already standing at the edge of a precipice no one intended to warn him about. But as the inner circle tightened its grip, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of everything, and ignite a conflict she never imagined she'd have to fight. For years, Sarah Ferguson was dismissed as the outsider, the rebel, the duchess who never fit the royal mold. But what the public never saw was the moment she finally stood her ground, not for herself, but for Andrew. It was a confrontation so raw and unexpected that royal aides reportedly froze in disbelief, because in that moment, Sarah crossed a line one the crown never forgave. And the truth is, it didn't happen in a grand hall or during some dramatic public event. It unfolded in a quiet, controlled space where voices were meant to remain calm and where rules were enforced not through shouting, but through cold, calculated pressure. Sarah had been summoned under the guise of a discussion. But from the moment she entered, she sensed the intention. To silence her, to sever her influence, to push her into irrelevance for the sake of palace stability. What those advisors underestimated, however, was her resolve honed not through privilege, but through years of surviving humiliation, exile, and the slow erosion of trust from those she once considered family. The confrontation began with polite warnings, masked behind phrases about public duty and institutional protection. But beneath the polished language was a clear message. Sarah needed to step back, stay quiet, and allow the palace machine to shape Andrew's future without interference. And for a moment, she listened until one advisor crossed a line, implying that her presence was harming Andrew more than helping him. That single comment shattered every restraint she had held. Her refusal to remain silent exploded into the room with a force none of them anticipated. She didn't raise her voice to be dramatic. She raised it because she knew what they were asking. They wanted compliance. They wanted her to vanish from the narrative. They wanted Andrew isolated and malleable, and she would not let that happen. Attempts to intimidate her followed swiftly. Mentions of press access, subtle references to financial vulnerabilities, veiled hints that certain privileges could be removed if she didn't comply. But each threat only sharpened her resolve. Sarah pushed back harder, dismantling their arguments with a clarity that startled even her detractors. She exposed the selective leaks, the whispered manipulation, the coordinated narrative shaping, things she had quietly observed for years, but never confronted directly. The advisors, stunned by her defiance, shifted to quieter tactics, softer threats, insinuations, the kind of psychological squeezing designed to make most people fold. She met every insinuation with a fierce, unwavering conviction that Andrew needed support, not abandonment, not pressure, not isolation. What none of them realized in that moment was that by trying to corner her, they were forging a new loyalty between Sarah and Andrew. The palace's attempt to divide them had the opposite effect. It drew her closer, filled her with a fire that would define every move she made in the years that followed. But defiance comes with consequences. Her stand created a new enemy within the palace, one with influence, reach, and a long memory. And while Sarah fought battles in the light, Andrew was being drawn into something far more dangerous in the shadows. There is a night Andrew has never spoken, publicly a night when the walls closed in and the pressure became unbearable. It wasn't the interviews, the headlines, or the global outrage. It was something more personal, more devastating. A moment when he realized that the people he trusted most inside the palace had turned their backs on him, and the only person he had left was the one who had already been exiled for years. That night marked the point at which the carefully constructed world around him finally cracked, revealing the cold truth he had ignored for far too long. Loyalty within the monarchy was conditional, and once that condition was broken, the fall was swift, merciless, and absolute. For hours, Andrew sat alone, surrounded not by advisors or family but by unanswered calls, and the suffocating knowledge that every door he had once walked through freely had quietly closed. It was the silence that broke him, the kind of silence that doesn't simply fill a room but presses against the chest, tightening with each desperate breath. He had been reassured for months that the institution would protect him, that the storm circling him would be managed, contained, controlled. But that night, the final message arrived, and it was unmistakable in its cruelty. He would be the shield, the sacrifice, The one held out to calm the chaos, while others quietly stepped back into safety. The institution would survive. He would not. His breaking point came in a single shattering moment when he realized the strategy was never designed to save him. It was designed to absorb the blow using his name, his reputation, his downfall. That understanding shook him so deeply that for a terrifying instant he felt the world blur, the weight of betrayal collapsing every last boundary he had carefully held together. And with no one left to turn, to no sibling, no advisor, no parent offering refuge, his shaking hands reached for the only number that ever brought him clarity. Sarah's. When she answered, she didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. She recognized the hollow tremor in his breathing, the same one she had heard years ago when the early cracks in their royal lives first started forming. In that moment, the years that separated them from their marriage, the scandals, the criticisms, the self-protective distance, all of it evaporated. Sarah became the anchor he had been denied in every direction. She didn't scold him or interrogate him. She just listened as his voice broke, as he admitted that he finally understood what she had been warning him about. That the palace would protect the crown, not the individual. And certainly not him. In the hours that followed, the emotional collapse reshaped him. The certainty he once carried, the privilege, the confidence, the unshakable belief in his place, crumbled into something far more vulnerable. But within that vulnerability came something unexpected. Clarity. For the first time, he understood the true cost of silence, the danger of allowing others to control his narrative, and the power he and Sarah still held when they stood together rather than apart. This night was not just a breaking, it was a recalibration, a painful, humiliating, necessary shift that bound them again with a shared understanding of what had been taken from them. And beneath the pain, one thought began to take shape, a thought that would soon turn into a decision neither could reverse. If the palace could sacrifice him so easily, then perhaps the only protection left was the truth they had kept locked away for decades. But if Andrew's collapse brought them together, what happened next bound them with a purpose they could no longer ignore. Few people know the full truth behind the letter, sealed, hand-delivered, and intended to disappear forever. A letter Sarah wrote in a moment of absolute clarity. A letter Andrew begged her not to send, and a letter that shook the palace to its core when it surfaced. Because inside that letter was not just a confession, but an accusation. It was born from a breaking point, the moment Sarah realized that silence was no longer a shield but a weapon being used against them. After years of being painted as the reckless outsider, after watching Andrew crumble under the weight of betrayal, she reached a point where the cost of staying quiet exceeded the cost of speaking out. She wrote the letter not out of anger, but out of a fierce, unshakable belief that the truth, however dangerous, was their last remaining defense. The words spilled out of her with a clarity she had not felt in years. She named names. She detailed manipulations. She exposed conversations that senior advisors had assumed she was too distracted, too emotional, too irrelevant to remember. But Sarah had always been underestimated, and that underestimation became her greatest advantage. When Andrew discovered what she had written, fear flashed through him, not for himself, but for her. He knew the palace's capacity for quiet retaliation. He knew how it punished those who defied the unwritten rules of loyalty. He pleaded with her to burn the letter, to forget the impulse and trust that things would eventually calm. But Sarah, strengthened by the night Andrew broke and the pain she carried from battles she fought alone, refused. The letter was not a threat. It was a record, a shield, a line in the sand. When the palace received it, panic rippled through senior advisors like a shockwave. It was not the content alone that terrified them, but the fact that Sarah had documented everything. Dates, conversations, directives, and most damning of all, moments when decisions were made to use Andrew as a buffer for controversies he did not create. They didn't respond directly. Instead, they launched a quiet but urgent campaign to bury the letter's existence. Copies were ordered to be destroyed. Staff were instructed to treat it as if it never existed. Even Andrew was approached privately, urged to manage Sarah before she caused irreparable damage. But the more the palace tried to suppress it, the the more obvious its power became. What they didn't anticipate was the unexpected ally who had seen the letter before it vanished. Someone within the machinery, a person long dismissed as a minor figure, had sensed its significance and kept a copy. When it resurfaced, whispered back into Andrew and Sarah's orbit, it deepened the rift between Andrew and the powerful insiders who had orchestrated his downfall. Suddenly, he had proof of manipulation, proof of selective silencing, proof of a narrative engineered from within. The discovery didn't just anger him, it changed him. For the first time, he saw the palace not as a guardian but as an architect of his ruin. The letter became the turning point, the spark that transformed quiet resentment into a decision with irreversible consequences. If the institution could go to such lengths to hide the truth, then they had nothing left to protect by remaining silent. The world had to hear their side, their history, their wounds, and the forces that shaped them. And just when the palace thought it had regained control, Sarah uncovered something that changed the scale of the conflict entirely. It started with a forgotten box, dusty, unlabeled, and tucked deep in a private office no one had entered in years. Inside were documents that connected dots Andrew and Sarah had never dared to consider. Records, communications, even personal notes that revealed how far the palace had gone to control their story. And in that moment, they realized the truth was not just about them. It was about a system built on silence. What they found didn't simply contradict the narratives they had been forced to accept. It dismantled them entirely. The pages didn't read like neutral records, they read like a blueprint, a long-standing strategy designed to protect the institution while isolating anyone who strayed from its script. Each sheet exposed a new layer of manipulation, revealing a trail that had quietly shadowed them for years, shaping public perception through calculated leaks and subtle distortions. As they sifted through the files, the patterns grew impossible to ignore. There were memos detailing decisions made before Andrew even knew problems existed, directives written by people who claimed they were defending him, yet were clearly preparing to distance the palace from any fallout. Sarah found notes that mentioned her by code names, derogatory ones used by advisors who pretended to respect her in public. There were outlines of media strategies designed to shift blame, divert criticism, and protect those whose involvement would have caused catastrophic damage if revealed. And buried underneath those carefully curated documents were the handwritten annotations, from figures Andrew had trusted, proof that he had not simply been abandoned, but deliberately placed at the forefront of a storm, engineered to conceal deeper failures within the palace. Among the most devastating discoveries was a report suggesting that Andrew and Sarah had been targeted deliberately, marked as expendable, long before any scandal erupted. It wasn't just that they were deemed inconvenient, they were considered ideal shields. Their unconventional personalities, their complicated history, their lingering bond, it all made them easier to weaponize. The files outlined a timeline of interventions, subtle steering of narratives, strategic briefings to journalists, even recommendations to advisors about how to manage Andrew's public image in ways that kept him vulnerable. It became painfully clear that their reputations had been shaped not by their actions alone, but by a system determined to maintain control at any cost. What struck Andrew hardest was the involvement of people he never suspected, figures he had defended, trusted, even considered friends. Their names appeared again and again in margins and directives, each revelation cutting deeper than the last. Rage rose in him, not the explosive kind, but a slow, suffocating fury that settled in his chest and refused to move. Sarah watched him closely, recognizing the mix of disbelief and betrayal she had once carried herself. And in that quiet room, the weight of the truth settled onto both of them with terrible clarity. They had never stood a chance as long as the palace held the pen that wrote their story. The final pages were what changed everything. Correspondence confirming that efforts to silence them had intensified. The moment whispers of their private concerns reached the wrong ears. Proof that the palace feared not their actions, but their potential to speak. Sarah placed her hand lightly on one of the documents, her voice barely above a whisper when she said, "The world deserves to know." It wasn't anger that drove her, it was conviction. And for the first time, Andrew didn't argue. He simply nodded, understanding that the truth they had uncovered was bigger than their pain, bigger than their reputations, bigger even than the monarchy's carefully guarded image. And with that decision came the moment the monarchy feared most, the moment Andrew and Sarah prepared to break their silence. When Andrew and Sarah sat down together for the first time in years with cameras rolling, they thought they were just rehearsing, but someone inside their circle secretly recorded the conversation, and that recording became the final spark, because in that unguarded moment, they spoke with brutal honesty about everything. What they saw, what they lost, and who they believed had orchestrated their downfall. It was supposed to be a private exchange, a raw, unpolished rehearsal meant only for them, as they prepared to reveal the truth the palace had spent decades smothering. They believed they were alone, protected, finally able to speak without calculation or caution. Instead, their vulnerability became ammunition. The recording captured more than words, it captured their exhaustion, their grief, their fury, and the heavy ache of betrayal that neither of them had ever dared express so openly. Andrew, usually guarded and restrained, spoke with a clarity he had never shown in public. He named the person he believed had betrayed him, not out of spite, but out of a painful certainty that had been building for years. He described patterns, decisions, and manipulations that pointed to a figure he once trusted, someone who had been close enough to devastate him and powerful enough to twist narratives with surgical precision. Sarah listened, her voice cracking only when she confessed her deepest fear. That the royal machine, once activated, would not stop until every trace of their truth was erased. She feared not for herself, but for Andrew, whose entire identity had been built around the institution now trying to erase him. The words were intimate, unfiltered, and devastatingly honest. That was what made them dangerous. Whoever recorded the conversation knew exactly what they were doing. And when that recording leaked not to the public, but to a very specific inner circle, panic erupted behind palace doors. The wrong people had heard the wrong truths. The crown, which relied on shadows and silence, suddenly found itself staring into a mirror, reflecting the damage it had caused. A race began, quiet yet frantic, to contain the recording before it reached anyone who could use it to expose the machinery working beneath the monarchy's polished image. Behind closed doors, advisors scrambled. Phone calls were made in hushed tones. Meetings were convened with urgent secrecy. The recording proved what the palace had long feared. Andrew and Sarah were no longer manageable. They were informed, united, and dangerously close to speaking with a clarity that could fracture the illusion of control the monarchy depended on. Rumors rippled through corridors like cracks spreading across a fragile surface. Some wanted the recording destroyed immediately. Others wanted to confront Andrew before he realized how much power it gave him. But what none of them understood was that the damage had already been done. The recording had not broken Andrew and Sarah, it had solidified them. Hearing their own words, stripped of diplomacy and pretense, forced them to confront the truth they had tiptoed around for years. They were no longer fighting for reputation. They were fighting for justice, for their family, for the truth buried under layers of silence and manipulation. If there had been any hesitation before, the recording obliterated it. It made their mission undeniable, urgent, and irreversible. With the walls closing in and the stakes higher than ever, they made the choice that would change royal history forever. When Andrew and Sarah finally sat down to speak the words they had held back for decades, the world expected scandal. But what they delivered was something far more powerful, an emotional, fearless confession that exposed not just their past, but the machinery that shaped it. It wasn't about clearing their names. It was about revealing the truth they felt the monarchy could no longer hide. In the room where they spoke, there was no makeup team, no advisors, no carefully crafted statements, just two people who had been pushed to the edge of silence and finally refused to stay there. The moment the cameras turned on, something shifted inside both of them. Not desperation, not bitterness, but a profound sense of resolve. They were no longer defending themselves. They were exposing a system. Their decision to speak without permission had not been impulsive. It was the result of years of manipulation, loss, and quiet suffering that had finally crystallized into clarity. Andrew began first, his voice unsteady only for a heartbeat before settling into a tone that carried decades of unspoken truth. He didn't offer excuses or pleas for sympathy. Instead, he revealed a revelation, striking it reframed everything the public thought they knew about his downfall. He exposed the role of insiders who had shaped narratives long before he even knew what he was being blamed for, revealing how strategic decisions were made to deflect attention away from failures that would have devastated far more powerful figures. It wasn't self-preservation, it was illumination, a pulling back of the curtain on a machine the public had only ever glimpsed in shadows. Sarah followed, and when she did, the emotional weight in her voice was unlike anything they had shared before. She spoke of the years she spent carrying truths alone, the battles she fought behind closed doors, and the sacrifices she made because she believed the monarchy was worth protecting, even when it refused to protect her in return. But it was her final statement that stopped the room cold. She didn't accuse or lash out. She simply said that truth loses all meaning when controlled by those who fear it. The silence that followed her words wasn't empty. It was stunned. It was the silence of realization, of consequences forming in real time, of a narrative that could not be contained again. Behind palace walls, the response was immediate and frantic. Advisors scrambled to issue statements, redirect attention, and soften the impact of what Andrew and Sarah had just unleashed. But no amount of damage control could undo what had been spoken. The confession had opened a door the institution had spent decades trying to keep locked. It had forced a reckoning, one that revealed fractures within the monarchy's foundations that could no longer be ignored. And beneath all the fallout lay a truth the public had sensed but never heard articulated with such clarity. The monarchy could never return to what it was before this moment, and as the world reacts to their words, one thing becomes clear. Andrew and Sarah have not just broken the silence. They've started a reckoning no one in the royal family can escape. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.